Hello everyone, I'm Alex, and today I'm sharing with you a story that is as powerful as it is thought-provoking, the story of Victoria Langley. Victoria's journey is one of quiet resilience, a testament to the idea that true value is not found in appearances, but in the essence of who we are and what we build. For years, she was cast aside by her own family, dismissed as insignificant, while they chased status and superficial success. But while they sought validation from society, Victoria was building something far greater, the Hidden Pearl, a world-class restaurant that would one day redefine prestige on her own terms. This story isn't just about success, it's about recognition, redemption, and the realization that respect is earned, not given. As Victoria herself puts it, true value is not in appearance, but in essence. If you truly want to understand that, you know where to begin. Let's dive in. Victoria Langley stepped out of the sleek black town car, her every movement controlled, deliberate. The entrance of the Ashford Country Club loomed ahead, the golden glow from its chandeliers spilling through the glass doors onto the polished marble driveway. Inside, Boston's elite mingled effortlessly, their laughter crisp, their words carefully curated to project power and influence. She knew exactly why she was here, why the invitation had arrived so late, why her name had been printed in the smallest font, barely an afterthought. It wasn't an invitation. It was an obligation. The moment she entered, the whispers slithered through the air like a well-rehearsed symphony. She actually showed up. That's the sister, isn't it? The one with the, what is it, a pub? No, darling, a bistro. At least, that's what they tell people. Victoria had spent years perfecting the art of indifference, but the weight of those words wasn't lost on her. She wasn't here as a guest. She was here as a spectacle. At the center of it all stood her mother, Eleanor Langley, regal in her deep emerald gown, her presence commanding as she held court among the city's most influential women. Beside her, radiant and glowing in her 7-month pregnancy, was Charlotte, the perfect daughter, the one who had never disappointed. Victoria approached, her expression unreadable, her every step a quiet rebellion against the decades of dismissal. Victoria, Eleanor greeted, the name itself sounding like an afterthought, as if it had been plucked from a memory long abandoned. I wasn't sure you'd come. You weren't hoping I would. Charlotte, draped in diamonds gifted by her investment banker husband, offered a thin smile. You look, well. Her gaze flickered over Victoria's attire, an exquisitely tailored black dress, understated but impossibly elegant. There was no excess, no desperate attempt to impress. And somehow, that made it even more unsettling. I heard you're still running that little bistro. Eleanor mused, her voice carrying the practiced ease of someone who believed herself untouchable. Still. The word hung between them like an unspoken insult. Victoria didn't blink. Yes, she replied, a hint of amusement curling at the edges of her lips. Business is quite exclusive these days. She saw the flicker of confusion in Eleanor's eyes, the slightest hesitation before the conversation pivoted. But before she could press further, Charlotte's voice chimed in, light, airy, just sharp enough to cut. Oh, by the way, about the seating arrangements, there was a slight mix-up, Charlotte began, feigning regret. With the number of guests, we had to make a few adjustments. But don't worry, there's a wonderful little bar down the street. It might be more your style. Ripples of laughter spread from the surrounding guests, champagne glasses clinking in quiet amusement. For the briefest of moments, Victoria let the insult settle, feeling its shape, its weight. Then she smiled, the kind of smile that carried the promise of an inevitable reckoning. She had played this game for a decade, silent, invisible, underestimated. They thought they had won. But they had no idea the rules had already changed. Victoria Langley descended the marble staircase of the Ashford Country Club, her posture poised, her movements effortless. The air buzzed with laughter and conversation, but there was an undercurrent, a tension so subtle it could have been mistaken for elegance. She could feel their eyes on her, the weight of their whispered judgments pressing in from all sides. She had spent years perfecting her silence, allowing them to believe their own carefully curated narrative. To them, she was an afterthought, a forgotten inconvenience who had drifted far from the glittering world of high society. They had convinced themselves she had settled for mediocrity, that she existed on the fringes, just close enough to be tolerated but never truly belonging. They were wrong. At a corner table, where the candlelight flickered against the crystal stemware, sat Gregory Matheson, a name that carried weight in the circles Eleanor and Charlotte desperately sought to impress. An art collector of international renown, his taste dictated the value of emerging artists, his endorsements transforming obscurity into legend. And at that moment, his sharp gaze landed on Victoria. "Chef Langley," he said, standing as she approached. The words cut through the air like a scalpel, drawing a quiet hush across the nearby tables. Conversations faltered, glasses hesitated midair. Eleanor Langley, mid-laugh with the wife of a senator, froze. Charlotte's polished smile flickered, her grip tightening around the stem of her champagne flute. Daniel Caldwell, Charlotte's husband and a man who measured power in dollar signs and exclusivity, narrowed his eyes, the gears of calculation already turning in his mind. Victoria inclined her head slightly, a glimmer of amusement flickering in her eyes. "Mr. Matheson," she greeted smoothly. "I hope you've been well." A slow, knowing smile crossed his face. "More than well, after that last meal at the Hidden Pearl. The truffle risotto was masterful." He turned to the table, speaking as if Victoria's presence was nothing short of an honor. "Victoria here runs the most exclusive dining experience in Boston, though I suppose most of you already knew that." They hadn't. The truth settled over the room in a slow, suffocating realization. The Hidden Pearl. The name alone carried weight, whispered in hushed tones at executive meetings and private gatherings. It was more than a restaurant, it was a fortress of prestige, a place where only those deemed worthy gained entry. And Victoria owned it. Charlotte was the first to recover, her laugh slightly too high, too forced. "Oh, yes, of course. We've heard wonderful things." Her eyes darted toward her husband, searching for confirmation, for an anchor in this sudden shift of power. Daniel nodded stiffly. "It's impossible to get a reservation," he admitted, his tone measured, controlled. "The executives at my firm have been trying for months." Victoria smiled, slow and deliberate. "Yes, we do have a rather exclusive policy." She let the words settle, watching the way Eleanor's fingers curled against the pristine white tablecloth. It was the perfect irony. For years, they had prided themselves on their connections, their ability to maneuver through society with effortless grace. And yet, the very thing they coveted most, the status, the exclusivity, was something they had unknowingly been locked out of. "I assume you've dined there, Eleanor?" Matheson asked, his voice carrying the kind of casual curiosity that demanded an answer. A muscle tightened in Eleanor's jaw. For the first time in years, she hesitated. "Oh, well," she started, the elegant veneer beginning to crack, She hasn't," Victoria said simply. The words were not cruel, nor were they triumphant. They were merely the truth. A sharp silence followed. Eleanor Langley had built her reputation on control, on orchestrating every detail of her life with meticulous precision. But at this moment, standing in the world she had so carefully crafted, she was a woman caught unprepared, stripped of her usual armor. Charlotte, always the strategist, leaned forward slightly, her expression softening into something dangerously close to charm. "Perhaps we should change that," she offered. "It would be lovely to experience the Hidden Pearl, as a family." The words were a lifeline, an attempt to reframe the narrative before it spiraled further out of control. Victoria tilted her head, considering. "I'm afraid it's not that simple." Daniel's brows furrowed. "Surely an exception can be made," he said, the barest hint of impatience seeping into his voice. "There are no exceptions," Victoria replied smoothly. "Reservations are only granted through letters of recommendation." And even then, the recommender must be a trusted guest of the restaurant. It was a flawless system, one designed not just to ensure exclusivity, but to prevent exactly this type of entitlement. Eleanor exhaled sharply through her nose. I see. But she didn't. Not really. Charlotte's fingers drummed lightly against the table, the tension in her shoulders betraying the carefully curated calm. Perhaps we can work something out. Victoria met her gaze, holding it for a moment longer than necessary. Then she smiled, the same quiet, knowing smile that had unsettled Charlotte since the moment she arrived. Perhaps, she murmured. And with that, she excused herself, leaving them in the wake of the truth they had never seen coming. They had dismissed her. They had pitied her. And now, for the first time, they realized. Victoria Langley had never needed their world. It was they who needed her. Eleanor Langley sat at the polished mahogany dining table of her Newton estate, sunlight pouring through the grand bay windows, illuminating the delicate china teacup trembling in her manicured fingers. The morning had begun like any other, coffee brewed to perfection, the crisp Boston Globe spread open beside her. Until she saw it. A full-page spread. The Hidden Pearl, Boston's most exclusive culinary sanctuary. The bold black headline seemed to scream at her, mocking the years of willful ignorance she had wrapped herself in. Beneath it was a striking black-and-white photograph of Victoria, poised and commanding in her crisp white chef's coat, arms folded with the quiet confidence of someone who no longer sought permission. Eleanor's breath hitched. The accompanying article unraveled before her in sharp, elegant prose. For a decade, Chef Victoria Langley has cultivated an empire of exclusivity. The Hidden Pearl, a 2-Michelin-starred restaurant in the heart of Beacon Hill, has redefined fine dining, welcoming only those who truly appreciate the art of cuisine. With a strict, invitation-only reservation process, the restaurant has become the epitome of prestige, drawing world leaders, Nobel laureates, and industry titans alike. Yet, despite her meteoric success, Langley has remained an enigma, until now. Eleanor's fingers gripped the newspaper tighter as the words carved themselves into her consciousness. Trained in France under the legendary Jean-Pierre Duffert, Langley returned to the States with a vision, one that rejected the notion that prestige was a birthright. Instead, she built a sanctuary where value was earned, not inherited. In cuisine, Langley states, what matters isn't excess, but intention. I want to share that joy only with those who understand it. Eleanor's heart pounded, but she wasn't the only one reeling from the revelation. Across town, in a penthouse overlooking the Boston skyline, Charlotte Langley sat frozen on her velvet chaise lounge, the same article displayed on her tablet. The words blurred at the edges as the implications sank in. She had spent years believing, knowing, that she was the one who had won. She had married well, secured a pristine reputation, and upheld the family name. But now, it was Victoria's name that mattered. Her husband, Daniel, entered the room, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit. You've been staring at that screen for a while, he mused. What so? He trailed off as his eyes flicked to the headline. Silence thickened between them. After a moment, he exhaled sharply, rubbing his jaw. The Hidden Pearl? He muttered. You're kidding. Charlotte turned to him, her voice hollow. You knew. Daniel scoffed. Knew. Every executive at my firm has been trying to get a reservation for months. It's a status symbol. A place you don't get into unless you're somebody. He studied the article again, his brows furrowing. And your sister owns it? Charlotte's stomach twisted at the incredulity in his tone, as if the idea of Victoria holding real power was inconceivable. She had spent her entire life dismissing her sister, reducing her existence to a footnote in their family's history. But now, in the circles that truly mattered, she was the footnote. Can you get us in? Daniel asked, his voice laced with forced nonchalance. Charlotte's throat tightened. She didn't know the answer. That evening, Eleanor arrived at the entrance of the Hidden Pearl, the weight of pride and humiliation pressing into her chest like a vice. The building stood dignified in the soft glow of the city lights, its historic brick facade revealing nothing of the prestige within. The hostess, a young woman with the air of quiet authority, greeted her with professional detachment. "Good evening. Do you have a reservation?" Eleanor lifted her chin. "I'd like to see Victoria." "Tell her it's her mother." The hostess didn't flinch. "One moment, please." She disappeared into the restaurant, leaving Eleanor waiting in the cool autumn air. Through the glass, she could see glimpses of the interior, patrons leaning into hushed conversations over candlelit tables, their faces alight with something rare, reverence. It was a world Eleanor had always longed to control. And now, she was on the outside. The hostess returned, her expression unchanged. "I'm sorry, but Chef Langley has requested that you follow our standard reservation process." The words landed like a blow. Eleanor had spent her life walking through doors that others couldn't. She had never been denied entry. She cleared her throat, forcing a measured tone. "Perhaps you don't understand. I am her mother." The hostess remained unmoved. "I understand perfectly, ma'am." Eleanor exhaled sharply, her composure fraying at the edges. "There must be some exception." The hostess offered a small, polite smile. "There are no exceptions." For the first time, Eleanor felt the sharp sting of irrelevance. Across the city, Charlotte stood in front of the hidden pearl, her fingers tightening around a letter bearing Victoria's handwriting. The words were precise, deliberate. "True value is not in appearance, but in essence. If you truly want to understand that, you know where to begin." It was not an invitation. It was a challenge. The realization settled in her bones like a quiet, growing weight. Victoria had no intention of letting her in. Not until she earned it. And for the first time in her life, Charlotte wasn't sure if she could. Eleanor Langley had never been turned away from anything in her life. She stood outside the hidden pearl, her perfectly tailored cashmere coat shielding her from the autumn chill. The historic brick facade loomed before her, unassuming yet undeniably powerful. Inside, soft golden lights spilled across linen-draped tables where some of the most influential figures in Boston dined in quiet exclusivity. And yet, here she was, standing outside. A hostess with a composed expression greeted her. "Good evening. Do you have a reservation?" Eleanor smoothed an invisible crease on her gloves, lifting her chin. "I'd like to see Victoria." "Tell her it's her mother." The hostess nodded politely. "One moment, please." As Eleanor waited, her gaze flickered through the large windows, catching glimpses of an elegant world she had never truly understood. The patrons moved with an ease she recognized, powerful people, but not the ones who fought for status. No, these were the ones who had already won. A memory surfaced, unbidden. Decades ago, she had walked into an upscale restaurant with young Victoria in tow, gripping her daughter's hand tightly as she navigated Boston's high society. Victoria had been a quiet child, observant, absorbing everything. Eleanor had introduced herself with a smile laced with calculation, ensuring they were seated at the best table, ensuring they were seen. Back then, it had mattered, being in the right places, with the right people. She had taught Victoria that. And yet, somehow, her daughter had learned a different lesson. The hostess returned, her face unreadable. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but Chef Langley has requested that you follow the standard reservation process." Eleanor's fingers curled slightly, the weight of humiliation pressing against her. "I don't think you understand," she said, her voice carefully measured. "I'm her mother." The hostess's smile didn't waver. Chef Langley was very clear. "There are no exceptions." The words sliced deeper than they should have. Eleanor had been dismissed from social circles before, outmaneuvered by younger, newer women clawing for status. But this was something different. This wasn't society shutting her out. This was her own daughter closing the door. Across town, Charlotte sat in the nursery, rocking her newborn daughter in the dim glow of a bedside lamp. The newspaper lay discarded on the nearby chair, the weight of its revelation still settling in her chest. Victoria had won. Not just in success, not just in wealth, but in something greater. She had built a world where she was untouchable, where their mother's approval meant nothing, where Charlotte's carefully curated image held no power. A soft whimper from the baby pulled her from her thoughts. Charlotte glanced down, watching tiny fingers curl around her own. She had spent years trying to fit into the mold their mother had crafted. She had married the right man, attended the right events, upheld the Langley name. And yet, what had it truly amounted to? She thought back to the gala, to the moment Gregory Matheson had recognized Victoria, not as an outcast, not as a disappointment, but as a force. The imbalance of power had been swift, unrelenting. And Charlotte had never felt so small. Her phone vibrated against the armrest. Daniel. She hesitated before answering. "Tell me you got us in," he said, skipping pleasantries entirely. Charlotte closed her eyes, exhaustion pressing at her temples. "No." A pause. Then, clipped frustration. "What do you mean, no? She doesn't take reservations." Daniel exhaled sharply. "Charlotte, do you realize how ridiculous that is? We're family." Charlotte let out a dry laugh. "Funny. That didn't seem to matter before." Another silence. But this time, he didn't have an argument. Because the truth was undeniable. They had spent years treating Victoria as nothing more than a footnote in their lives. And now, they weren't even worth a seat at her table. Eleanor sat in the back seat of her car, staring out at the city lights as they passed. The world moved on, indifferent to the turmoil unraveling inside her. She had always believed in legacy. That the Langley name carried weight. That reputation was everything. And yet, Victoria had built something far greater, something beyond their reach. Her fingers tightened around the leather seat. For the first time, she wasn't sure if she had lost a daughter. Or if she had never really known her at all. Charlotte Langley stood outside the Hidden Pearl, her fingers gripping the heavy envelope in her hands. The paper was thick, the ink precise, Victoria's handwriting unmistakable in its clarity. True value is not in appearance, but in essence. If you truly want to understand that, you know where to begin. It wasn't an invitation. It was a test. For the first time in her life, Charlotte had no shortcuts. No name to lean on, no carefully arranged social connections to smooth her path. If she wanted entry into Victoria's world, she would have to earn it. Taking a breath, she stepped inside. The restaurant was already in motion. The air buzzed with quiet efficiency, a symphony of precision and control. Every chef, every server moved with purpose, their roles defined and respected. There were no unnecessary words, no wasted movements. It was a stark contrast to the world Charlotte had always known, where appearances mattered more than substance, where the illusion of effort was enough to secure status. Gabriel, the sous chef, barely glanced up as she approached. "You must be Charlotte." His voice was even, unreadable. "Follow me." She expected a private conversation, an explanation of what she was supposed to do. Instead, he led her straight into the heart of the kitchen, weaving through the controlled chaos of steaming pans, chopping knives, and plated dishes being whisked away with practiced ease. Gabriel stopped in front of a station at the back of the kitchen. A massive sink filled with dishes, the scent of soap and leftover food thick in the air. "You want to understand this place," he said simply, handing her a pair of gloves. "Start here." Charlotte stared at him, expecting some kind of hesitation, some acknowledgement that she was different, that she didn't belong here. But none came. Because in the Hidden Pearl, she wasn't Eleanor Langley's daughter. She wasn't the wife of a wealthy investment banker. She was just another pair of hands. And for the first time, she realized that was exactly the point. The first few nights were humiliating. Her manicured fingers ached from scrubbing, her arms sore from the constant motion of lifting heavy trays. The heat of the kitchen pressed in on her, sweat gathering at the nape of her neck as she scrubbed plates until her reflection blurred against porcelain. No one coddled her. No one acknowledged her struggle. She wasn't sure which was worse, the physical exhaustion or the realization that, in this place, she was invisible. The same way Victoria had been, for years. Days turned into weeks. The soreness dulled, her movements becoming more efficient. She learned the rhythm of the kitchen, the quiet cues, the unspoken rules. She listened. She watched. She learned. One night, as she reached for another stack of plates, a voice stopped her. "Come with me, Victoria." For a moment, Charlotte felt an old instinct rise, to straighten, to prepare some excuse, some justification. But she forced it down, following her sister through the kitchen, past the dining room where patrons sat in hushed reverence, into a private tasting room lit by soft, golden light. Victoria gestured toward a plate set on the table. "Sit." Charlotte did. In front of her was a dish, artful, deliberate, every element placed with intention. Victoria sat across from her, watching. "Taste it." Charlotte picked up the fork, hesitating for only a second before taking a bite. The flavors unfolded slowly, complex, layered, precise. It wasn't just food. It was a statement. A culmination of years of discipline, of choices that had led to this moment. She swallowed, something unexpected tightening in her chest. Victoria's voice was quiet. "That's 10 years of my life on a plate." Charlotte placed the fork down carefully, her throat thick. But there were no words that could undo the years between them. No apology grand enough to erase what had been lost. So she simply nodded. And for the first time, Victoria didn't look at her as an outsider. She looked at her as someone who was starting to understand. Morning light streamed through the arched windows of the Hidden Pearl's private dining room, casting a warm glow over the elegantly set table. It was a stark contrast to the lavish, ostentatious gatherings that Eleanor and Charlotte were accustomed to, no grand floral arrangements, no excessive displays of wealth. Instead, a single bouquet of wildflowers rested at the center. Delicate, understated. Chosen with care. Victoria placed the final dish before them, every element meticulously prepared. The room was silent, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. Eleanor sat stiffly, her hands clasped in her lap. For the first time in her life, she looked uncertain. Charlotte, seated beside her, had lost the polished, effortless demeanor she once wore like armor. Months of working in the kitchen had stripped away the pretense, replacing it with something quieter. Something real. Victoria finally sat across from them, her expression composed. "You wanted to understand value," she said, voice measured. "This is what it looks like." Eleanor exhaled, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. "You built something extraordinary." Victoria studied her for a moment before nodding. "I did." Charlotte glanced at her plate but didn't eat yet. Instead, she looked at Victoria, her voice softer than it had ever been. "I used to think success was about perception," she admitted. "About who we surrounded ourselves with, how we were seen. But I was wrong." Victoria didn't respond immediately. She didn't need to. The silence itself was an acknowledgement of how much had changed. For months, Charlotte had scrubbed dishes, prepped ingredients, witnessed the unshakable discipline of the kitchen. She had seen how respect was earned, not through status, but through effort, through purpose. Eleanor, once obsessed with image, now saw her daughter for what she truly was. Not a disappointment. Not a burden. But a woman who had built something untouchable. Victoria set her fork down, exhaling slowly. "So," she said, her voice softer now. Shall we try this again? As a family? For the first time, the word family felt like something worth rebuilding. Victoria's story is a powerful reminder that true value is not in appearance, but in essence. In a society consumed by status, fleeting recognition, and carefully curated facades, it's easy to mistake visibility for worth. But real success, the kind that lasts, comes not from the approval of others, but from what we build with patience, resilience, and purpose. Her family spent years crafting an illusion of superiority, believing prestige was something inherited, bought, or borrowed. Meanwhile, Victoria quietly mastered her craft, understanding that respect isn't given, it's earned. And when the moment of reckoning arrived, she didn't need revenge. The weight of her achievements spoke louder than their years of dismissal ever could. For today's world, where self-worth is too often tied to external validation, Victoria's story delivers a profound lesson: stop seeking permission to be great. Focus on substance over spectacle. Master your skills, cultivate your purpose, and build something so undeniably valuable that when the world finally notices, you won't need their validation. You will have already won.